So, for my project, I will be discussing the epistemology of virtue. And so, my presentation is entitled How to Know You're Being Good, the Epistemology of Virtue. And before I begin, I would just like to make a small distinction between what I will be doing in investigating the epistemology of virtue and virtue epistemology. I will not be discussing things that have come to be associated with virtue epistemology, such as the intellectual virtues or virtue reliabilism or virtue responsibilism. I will rather be discussing how one comes to know a virtuous act. So in looking at Aristotle, Alistair MacIntyre, and the philosopher James K.A. Smith, I will be looking at how one knows what a virtuous act is and what the proper act of virtue is in any given situation. So here's a brief overview of virtue before we begin. As outlined by Plato in the Republic, there are four primary virtues, or four cardinal virtues as they have come to be known: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And to this list of the four cardinal virtues, Aristotle in his work Rhetoric adds magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, and gentleness. And so for Aristotle, there are actually 8 total virtues, and those include, again, wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, and gentleness. And to possess these virtues results in what Aristotle and Plato call the good life or flourishing. This idea of the Greek word that they used, eudaimonia, which has poorly at times been translated as happiness, but really in the fullest sense of that word means the good life or human flourishing. So for Aristotle, virtuous acts are golden means between two opposite acts of vice. So if you care to think about the idea of virtue and virtuous acts as a spectrum, there is a golden mean of virtue in the middle, and then there is the lesser vice and the greater vice on either side of that golden mean of virtue. So taking, for example, courage is a golden mean between the vices of cowardice on the lesser and overconfidence or recklessness on the greater. And so at the core of Aristotle's theory of virtue is the notion that a virtuous person would know the perfectly correct thing to do in every situation. So taking, for example, let's say a building being on fire in New York City, the virtuous person, according to Aristotle, would know correctly what the courageous thing to do in that situation would be. And perhaps cowardice would be running away from the building, being afraid of being burned or killed or what have you. And overconfidence or recklessness, on the other hand, would be running into the building knowing full well that that person and the person that they were attempting to save perhaps would both perish in the fire. And so either of those acts would be vices for Aristotle. And so, again, at the core of his theory is the idea that a virtuous person would know the perfectly correct thing to do in every given situation. So with that being said, that naturally segues into the question at hand in this presentation, and that is, since Aristotle believes that a virtuous act is a golden mean, how does one know that they are engaging in the optimal act for a situation? Or we could even phrase this question in another way by saying, how does an individual know that their act is ideally courageous and devoid of all cowardice or overconfidence? Stated even more simply, we could ask, how does one come to knowledge of perfect virtue? And so this is the question at hand in this particular presentation. Now, in this presentation, I'll be discussing 3 main elements of the epistemology of virtue. And so the first element that I will be discussing is this notion of moral exemplars. First, Aristotle believed that it was necessary to surround yourself with examples of virtue in order to become a virtuous person. In order to know a virtuous act or to know the ideal action in any given situation, Aristotle believed that it was necessary to view and imitate the lives and actions of exemplars of virtue. Thus, in emulating these moral exemplars, an individual naturally moves closer and closer to living a life of virtue. So in plain terms, you learn virtue by watching it and then doing it. So that is the first element of the epistemology of virtue, is moral exemplars. The second element is what I will call habituation. Secondly, Aristotle stresses the fact that becoming virtuous requires practice. An excellent analogy is given by James K.A. Smith, who is a philosophy professor at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He wrote a great book entitled You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit, in which he writes, learning virtue or becoming virtuous is more like practicing scales on the piano than learning music theory. Learning here isn't just information acquisition. It's more like inscribing something into the very fiber of your being. And so in order to become virtuous, one must routinely engage in acts of virtue. So that's the second element of virtue epistemology, or epistemology of virtue, rather, habituation or practice. And thirdly, this is not an element that is original to Aristotelian thought on the virtue, or even to Aristotle himself, but the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, in his book After Virtue, contends that knowing virtue requires another key element, and that is a tradition or a narrative. And so in his book After Virtue, MacIntyre writes, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. And so whether the narrative that an individual aspires to in their life involves the traditions of family or religion or country, etc., these traditions involve or lack moral virtue. And so regardless of whether or not a person believes themselves to be engaged in a story or a narrative or a tradition in their life, MacIntyre would contend that we are all storied or narratival beings. And so therefore that is what cultivates virtue in us, is even going along with this tradition or narrative or story that we choose to be a part of. So again, summed up, the elements of the epistemology of virtue are moral exemplars, habituation, and tradition or narrative. And so in thinking about this idea of habituation, there was an issue presented to me of question begging. So in asserting that virtues take practice, Aristotle appears to be question begging. Since our question involves the epistemology of virtue, how is it the case that one is able to practice acts of virtue by doing acts of virtue if one is not even sure in the first place what the correct act of virtue is? So, for example, to make this a bit more simple, how can I practice acts of justice if I do not truly know what a just act is in the first place? So there are two responses that I would give to this issue. Firstly, it is important to recognize that these three epistemological structures are to be unified. All three work together in order to allow for knowledge of virtuous acts, and they cannot be separated from one another. You cannot have one without the others, or two without the other, or etc. And secondly, Aristotle even goes so far as to hint at the fact that virtues are divinely given. I will read this excerpt from the Nicomachean Ethics. He writes, for this reason, also the question is asked whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence or again by chance. Now, if there is any gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable that happiness should be God-given, and most surely God-given of all human things, inasmuch as it is the best. And so there is even an inclination in Aristotle that the virtues are divinely given. And so this is, again, divine epistemology, divinely given knowledge. So this notion of divinely given knowledge of the virtues certainly becomes a main focus of the later figure, St. Thomas Aquinas. And so here is the bibliography that I utilized for my presentation. I utilized Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, and James K.A. Smith's You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit. Thank you so much for listening.